Welcome to the next part of these podcasts. I'm John Moffatt from the Heathrop Institute at the London Jesuit Centre. You may be feeling a bit battered by this helter-skelter ride down the twisting slide of salvation history in the Jewish Tanakh. You are entitled to ask how all this material can be important for understanding the Advent themes of the first chapters of Luke and Matthew. Here then, before we slide down a bit further, is a thought to keep you going. We need to notice that all these books, which we tend to think of as history writing, were known to Jews at the time of Jesus as the prophets, alongside what we would more naturally think of as prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, or the prophets from Amos to Zedekiah. This tells us something important about how different groups of Jews were reading these texts at the time of Jesus, when Jerusalem was in territory under direct Roman control. The original authors were, of course, giving a theological interpretation of historical events in their own time. But their later readers, some of whom would become Jesus' followers, were reading their words as saying something about their contemporary situation. Sometimes they provided evidence of a fundamental pattern in God's behaviour, how God typically acts. For instance, rescuing his people from oppression, whether the oppressors are Egyptian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Greek, or, more immediately, Roman. This sort of reading then opens the eyes of the reader to look out for types, people or events or situations that fit those recognisable patterns in the world around them. That is something that deeply shapes the way the Gospel writers tell the story of Jesus. This is one sort of prophetic reading of text. But more straightforwardly, the reader might simply take a passage from its original context and read it as a direct prophecy relevant to the present time. This sort of reader meaning clearly goes beyond writer meaning and takes the interpretation of texts in new directions. In a world of lively faith, Jewish believers trusted that the God of the covenant was still talking to them through their sacred texts, in their contemporary context. When they found new meanings, they also trusted that they had really been there all along, intended by God, and waiting to be revealed to them in a moment of divinely given insight. The books of Samuel, as we've already begun to see, were particularly significant for shaping the language and theology of a royal Messiah. But equally important were the writings of first Isaiah, a court prophet who served under the kings of Judah, Uzziah, Ahaz and Hezekiah, and who witnessed the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. These writings lent themselves especially to later prophetic reading of text. So let's look at them more closely to identify what it was that leapt off the page for their later Christian Jewish readers. In the books of Samuel, we can read an attempt to make theological sense of an important political transition in the story of the covenant and the Lord's promise to God's people. Earlier, the tribes had formed a loosely federated people governed by prophetic judges, worshipping the Lord at a number of different sacred places. The most important of these, Shiloh, contains the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred and real symbol of the presence of God, and thus of that special protective relationship between the Lord and God's people. How do we get from there to a king reigning in Jerusalem? The first book of Samuel begins with recognisable themes. The Lord speaks to a specially chosen individual and calls him to speak his word as a prophet and to rescue his people. As a prophet, Samuel declares a coming disaster, the direct result of failure of religious leadership at Shiloh. The disaster happens. The Philistines capture the Ark of the Lord and take it away to their capital at Ashdod. But then, as a judge and rescuer, Samuel eventually defeats the enemy and recovers the Ark. So far, so familiar. Nevertheless, in his old age, something new emerges, which completely changes the political relationships among the people of the covenant. The tribes come to him and demand a king, the same as the other peoples have. Who is in charge of this bit of the story? Samuel warns them of the consequences of having a king, of abandoning direct rule by God through his prophets, but the people insist. The relationships and religious power structures shift, and God seems to accept this. The prophet's task is now to identify and anoint the one chosen by God to save God's people. First, Samuel finds Saul and anoints him with oil, which makes him an anointed one, a Messiah in Hebrew, or Christ in Greek. That ritual relationship is, of course, still preserved in the coronation liturgy of English kings and queens, and in the more egalitarian liturgy of Christian baptism. Then, when Saul disobeys God and loses God's favour, Samuel is dispatched a second time to anoint a new Messiah, someone after God's own heart. He finds David still a boy, the youngest of the sons of Jesse, and, in a powerful bit of symbolism, a shepherd, a protector of sheep. We do not have space here to follow the twists and turns of the relationship between David, as he first becomes one of Saul's generals, but eventually replaces him and Saul, nor the underlying political tension as he becomes sole ruler not only of his own tribe of Judah, but of all the northern tribes of Israel as well. I'd recommend reading these books, which include some great pieces of storytelling with a wide cultural impact on later literature. However, the most important moment from our point of view as we follow the covenant trail is that with David, the covenant of Moses, made with the whole people, becomes fused with a covenant with an individual. In a powerful bit of symbolism, David brings the Ark of the Covenant and sets it up in a shrine next to his palace in his new capital of Jerusalem. Then, as he asks the court prophet Nathan whether he should build a proper temple or not, in Nathan's reply, God makes a new special promise to David and his dynasty. When your days are ended and you are laid to rest with your ancestors, I will preserve the offspring of your body after you and make his sovereignty secure. I will not withdraw my favour from him as I withdrew it from your predecessor. Your house and your sovereignty will always stand secure before me, and your throne be established forever. The unshakable promise of God to the people is now bound up with God's unshakable promise to protect the throne of David. This is the foundation for the theological narrative of the Messiah, the rescuer king anointed by God to save the people in an eternal covenant of grace. That narrative powerfully shapes the expectations of the Jewish people at the time of Jesus and dominates the early chapters of Luke's and Matthew's Gospels. We're now ready to see how that plays out in Luke's Gospel, as Gabriel speaks of the child that Mary will bear, in a scene that echoes many ancient divine encounters with the promise of children. We should start with the name. You shall call him Jesus. We can recall that the name means God saves. Again and again in the writing of Isaiah, God is defined as the God who saves. And as we said before, the name Jesus is a Greek form of the name for Joshua, the chosen protector of God's people who leads them into the promised land. But let's look a little further on. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David. He will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and his reign will have no end. We can recognize something old and something new. It is no longer the dynasty that will have no end. It is the reign of this new king that will have no end. And the promise is not just for the house of David, but the house of Jacob, of Israel, the whole people of God. Later in the story, when Mary visits Elizabeth, she sings a song of praise, which Western Christians often refer to from its first word in the Latin version as the Magnificat. The words of the song echo the song of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, from the beginning of the book of Samuel. Hannah, like Sarah in Genesis and Elizabeth in Luke, appeared unable to have a child, but by the grace of God conceived a child, Samuel, in fulfilment of God's promise. Hannah's song is a song of triumph over the people who mocked her for being childless. But it is also a song of revolution. God is the God who overpowers the strong and protects the weak. That same revolutionary flavour is present in Mary's song as well. He has routed the proud of heart. He has pulled down princes from their thrones and exalted the lowly. But the punchline proclaims the insight that the child in her womb, the heir of David that she carries, fulfills God's ancient promise to rescue the people, a promise that goes all the way back to Abraham. He has come to the help of Israel his servant, mindful of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever. John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, at the birth of his son, also has a song which underlines that the Lord is at work now, rescuing his people by raising up a power of salvation in the house of David, his servant. God, in these times, is fulfilling words proclaimed by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old. And this act of rescue is entirely in accord with the covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to keep his people free from fear, rescued from the hands of their enemies, able to live the way of the Lord in peace. But notice too the tension present from the beginning of the Gospels in this reference to kingship, rescue and salvation. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, David's town, but in distinctly humble circumstances, with echoes of the migrant Abraham, and of course, David the shepherd boy himself. It is to a rough and ready group of hired shepherds that Luke's angel proclaims good news. This good news, this joy is, however, for the whole people. A rescuer has been born, the Anointed One, the Lord. So this Messiah and rescuer fulfills the promise made to David and the promise made to the whole people, particularly the disenfranchised poor. But what exactly is he to rescue his people from? And how is he to achieve it? In the next episode, we'll explore how Matthew and Luke begin to tell this new turn in salvation history. Thank you for listening.